Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Classical Academy Podcast, your friendly guide to the world of classical Christian education. Napoleon Bonaparte. Hero, villain, military genius, narcissistic tyrant, a figure from the past we can forget, or a historical present who still shapes the modern world? Great questions. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Phillips. My guest today who will help us answer these questions is Morgan Geiser. He teaches 9th grade Roman Lit, 12th grade U.S. History, and 11th grade European History. In fact, Morgan has a master's in history from the University of Georgia with a specialty in early modern France. He's also spent time in France as an exchange student and is fluent in Francais. What better person to tell us about one of the most famous, or perhaps infamous, Frenchmen of all time, Napoleon. Bonsoir, Monsieur Geiser. Welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So I think the first question that people want to know is, why do we study Napoleon?
Well, Napoleon definitely represents a major turning point in European history. I think Napoleon very much embodies many aspects of the Enlightenment. And as Napoleon conquers Europe, he spreads a lot of those ideas with him. Things that we might take for granted today, like public education, equality before the law, even constitutionalism. These are things that Napoleon will take with him, and even after he's gone, a lot of these institutions he sets up will long outlive him.
Yes, I know he's always been known for his military genius. I was looking over his battles. It's like 70 victories, 11 defeats. His defeats were pretty serious, though, duh. Yet his political influence is really of monumental import, as you're saying. And I was speaking with our fine producer earlier today, say, gee, I wonder if he loved democracy or himself more. I guess it's himself. So what's the context of understanding Napoleon's rise to power?
Well, Napoleon came from a relatively actually impoverished minor aristocratic family in Corsica, of all places.
Yeah.
And if it hadn't been for the French Revolution, I think the most he could have hoped for in his life was like a mildly successful military career.
Yes.
He wasn't even the firstborn son, and so that even would have further limited his opportunities. But thankfully for Napoleon, he was alive at the right time. And the French Revolution, it was a very tumultuous time.
Sure.
Many of the generals in the French army just left France. They didn't agree with the revolution. Others would actually be killed for losing a battle. So this created a lot of opportunities for social advancement.
I'd probably leave if that were the stakes.
No.
So you talked a little bit about Napoleon's impact. How does he shape overall European history? I mean, go into a little more detail on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So as Napoleon rises up through the ranks, he becomes known as the savior of the revolution. France is at war with many of its neighbors. There's a lot of questions. Is the revolution going to survive? Is it going to survive from internal and external enemies? And while Napoleon's rising in popularity, the government of France at the time, which is called the Directory, was really growing unpopular. It was unstable. There were lots of coups, lots of counter-coups. And Napoleon uses this opportunity to overthrow the government with his position as general. He will create a new government with himself as head. And a few years later, he'll get rid of any charade of republicanism and crown himself emperor of France.
Yes, which is so interesting because he rose to power as a result of overthrowing royalty. And so I know it's interesting. He did not declare himself king. He was wise enough not to do that, but not much difference with self-declaration of emperor.
But it's interesting because going back to your initial question about his impact on Europe. So from this position of power, we might look at him as in many ways a king, right?
Sure.
he does a lot to take some of the Enlightenment ideas and not just apply them in France, but also in a lot of these other lands that he's conquering. So like a very specific example, the Napoleonic Code. This was something that had a bigger impact on European history than any single battle he won or any victory. The Napoleonic Code, it was really the world's first civil law, as we might think of civil law today.
Sure.
And it codifies into law this idea that everyone's equal before the law. There aren't major privileges as far as aristocratic privilege. It applies to everyone equally. Like he makes this very clear in the beginning of his code. So some other examples that we see is public education.
Right.
Napoleon, he wanted an educated, really bureaucracy to support his empire. And to do this, he creates a standardized, what we would think of as like high school, like secondary education.
Sure.
He establishes lots of universities dedicated to arts and science. And ironically, despite the fact that Napoleon was a dictator, as he conquers, he spreads a lot of the constitutional ideas of the French Revolution with him.
Yes. It is very ironic. I mean, the whole idea of an educated populace doesn't really seem to support the idea of centralized authority. If the populace is educated, then they can care for themselves more. And so it's quite fascinating. Now, you were talking about the directory earlier. Was this a result of the result of the French Revolution, and they couldn't get their act together? And so you think Napoleon deliberately seized upon that, yet he still believed in what they were supposedly supposed to be doing, or the ideas just followed him? And I'm asking you to be a little mind reader, I'm sure, into Napoleon, but did he truly believe in these principles, or did they follow him because everyone associated him with them because he rose up after the revolution?
That's an excellent question. I think there's also a little bit of controversy in that. A lot of people, view Napoleon differently. Personally, I think maybe a mix of the two. I do think that Napoleon was self-serving. He could pivot his beliefs very quickly, and he, I think, tried to position himself to be as appealing to as many people as possible. An example of this is earlier in his career, Napoleon was a very dedicated Jacobin, what we might think of as maybe the more radical extreme of the French Revolution. And he becomes more moderate as it becomes better for his political career.
Yes.
But on the other hand, I do believe Napoleon was very well read in the Enlightenment, and he seemed to genuinely admire many of the ideas. And so I think while he was self-serving, he believed that what was best for him, like his own quest for power, would also be what was best for France.
Now, was he influenced at all by the American Revolution? Because it seemed to certainly have been more successful. I mean, we're still, for now, operating under the same Constitution from the 1780s. So did that influence him any, or was he too wrapped up, myopic about what was going on in Europe? Or is that even something people consider?
Yeah, that's another really good question. I don't know if I can speak specifically to what Napoleon himself may have drawn from the American Revolution, but definitely the French Revolution that he was a product of was observing the American experiment and what was going on.
Yeah, sure.
And so it makes you wonder what Napoleon himself...
And they were part of our revolution, as a matter of
absolutely.
Fight the British. Yeah. Well, that's fascinating. Now, you lived there a while studying. Did you ever get a chance to talk with people? I'm curious. We loved Paris when I was studying in England. We would go there. The Eurotrain was just so easy to get there, and fell in love with Paris. But I didn't really ever spend enough time there to get to know the French people. Did you get a sense of how they look back upon Napoleon?
Funny you ask that. When I was in France, I remember asking one of my closest friends there, her name is Emma, what she thought about Napoleon. Mm-hmm. I was just curious about that exact same question. And she paused for a second and she thought about it. And after thinking, she said, I don't think I really like Napoleon because he took away the right to vote from women. And then looking more broadly, it does seem like Napoleon has a very complicated legacy in France. Mm-hmm. He does seem very admired in many ways.
Sure.
Especially the victory on the battlefields. And
yes.
A few years ago, I don't exactly remember when, but there was some controversy about the EU portraying the Battle of Waterloo.
Yes.
Perhaps on a coin or another piece of currency. And I remember hearing some of my friends be upset about that.
Yes. There were many more better battles to remember, to recall, more genius of the military mind. What do you see as some of the key turning points in the life, destiny, and influence of Napoleon?
Well, I've already mentioned a few about his rise to power. 1804 is when he crowns himself Emperor of France. Mm-hmm. As far as his decline, it seems that later in his career he gets a little overly ambitious in his
Indeed.
military exploits. He invades the Iberian Peninsula. Mm-hmm. And then in 1812, he very notoriously invades Russia.
Yes, big mistake.
Absolutely.
Hitler didn't even learn from it.
Absolutely.
Fortunately.
And when Napoleon invades Russia in 1812, he actually doesn't invade in winter. Like, he invades in the summer.
Yes.
But as he's invading, Napoleon, one of his signature things as a military commander is he didn't like supply chains because they bogged him down. And so he goes in without supply chains, and his troops end up freezing and starving on the way home. So after that, it was all downhill from Napoleon.
Not a very popular move at that point.
No. Yeah. By 1814, the other European powers have declared war on France. They're closing in. And so Napoleon is forced to abdicate.
Yes.
And he's sent to the island of Elba, mm-hmm. but he returns to France in 1815 for a little over 100 days. But alas, he's defeated again at Waterloo.
Yes.
And in 1815, he goes into exile, and that's the last we see of him.
It lasts. This time it lasts. Yeah. So Morgan, I know we've touched on it a bit, and that is the significance, but anything you'd like to add to his significance to modern Europe as well as modern America? I mean, since that is the Western world, so to speak. Anything to add to his significance? It's a hard question to think about, but what would modern Europe and modern America be like without Napoleon's influence? And I guess that kind of tells you what his influence has been.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I think it's hard to overstate how much of an impact Napoleon and his empire have had on especially Europe, but also the world. Napoleon redrew the map of Europe during the time, mm-hmm. and as he does this, it awakens nationalism in a new way in Europe. For the first time, you have Germans who had been broken up into lots of little states, mm-hmm. fighting side by side and dying side by side together. And same with Italians. Mm-hmm. And so you start to have these identities, like these national identities forming.
Wow. Right. Yeah.
As a result of Napoleon. It awakens this nationalism. And maybe a tad bit related, but Napoleon and the French Revolution as well, it represents a major turning point in history as far as how people think about their role to their government, or their relationship to their government might be a better way to put it. So, for example, before the French Revolution, people are subjects to their king. And this represents a transition where people begin to think of themselves as citizens. And even if Napoleon is, in many ways, an absolute monarch, he still would have said that his power derived from the people. And as he conquers, like, these ideas spread as well into other European communities.
Wow, that's very significant. I mean, power from the people is, yeah, that's a pretty modern phrase. Popular here, hopefully still true to some extent. We certainly hear it from the politicians. How about now let's bring this into what's happening here at Trinity, what's happening in classical education. When you study this complex individual who certainly did have the ideas of citizenry and power from the people following him, no matter what his own personal motives might have been, how does that form the students when they're studying Napoleon?
That's an excellent question. I think there are many different things. So one that immediately comes to mind is, since Napoleon viewed himself as the embodiment of the Enlightenment, I think it allows students to engage maybe with some of the more practical implications of the Enlightenment. And we spend a lot of time in the European history class talking about and engaging with a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers, but it's totally different to see someone really trying to apply their ideas in a far more concrete way. And in Napoleon, we see really, I think, the best of the Enlightenment alongside some of the worst of the Enlightenment.
Right.
On one hand, as I've mentioned before, he's very interested in things like equality before the law. He's very interested in things like education and the abolition of feudalism and religious persecution. But on the other hand, we see some darker things going on, especially as he's using some of these Enlightenment ideas to justify this consolidation of power and war and the nationalism that feeds into this war and bloodshed.
So in a classical Christian school, of course, we have the idea of God's sovereignty in human history. And these kind of things always intrigue me, that he plucks up someone like Napoleon. He's somehow accomplishing his higher will through this man, this complex man, military genius who can be careless, a man who's committed to this idea of equality, who calls himself emperor. Very interesting. Do discussions about how God's sovereignty fit into a man like this ever come up? And what do the students think about something like that?
I don't know. I think that's a really difficult question to answer, especially for someone as complex as Napoleon. And I think our world is still really, in many ways, grappling with the consequences of what he did.
Sure.
And so I think it's difficult to say one way or another. But yeah, that's a wonderful question.
Do you think that was the French Revolution, which kind of birthed him, obviously, was it less God-centered? Is that the right way to put it? I always see the American Revolution as having this Christian foundation to it, lots of prayer going into it, studying of not only the ancient republics, but the Word, and was that not as present in the French Revolution, this Christian aspect, and therefore wasn't present as much in his influence on Europe and modern America as well?
Yeah, so in the French Revolution, you see a wide range of how people are thinking to apply, or where religion will fit within France. And there's really this vast spectrum. I mean, there are some people, probably more a minority within the revolutionary governments, especially early on, who recognize that Catholicism, which had formerly been the state religion of France, still needs a strong place. And then on the other hand, you have people wanting to make atheism or deism the state religion of France. But I'd say overall, the French Revolution was definitely, it viewed itself at war with the Catholic Church specifically.
Because it had been part of the aristocracy, so
yeah, absolutely.
They saw it like that. Yeah.
With Napoleon, he had a little more, I think, nuanced view of where religion would fit into France. I think while Napoleon was not himself very religious or God-centered, he viewed religion, specifically the Catholic Church, I think as maybe in a more utilitarian way.
Right.
When he comes to power, he'll actually bring the Catholic Church back to France.
Yes.
But he does this for purely political reasons.
Yes, he has conditions.
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
So,
Right. So how do you see students changing, developing? I mean, we're here, of course, to develop these students with our hope that they're young men and women of virtue, wisdom, purpose, and courage. That's behind everything we do here. How do you see studying Napoleon affecting them or changing them, or what kind of thoughts does it bring?
I think there's several things. Firstly, here at Trinity, when we study history, one of the things that we're really interested in is the complexity of history. Understanding that history isn't black or white, it's not good guys versus bad guys, that these are people, and as fallen human beings, we all have good and evil inside of us warring at all times.
Yes.
And I think Napoleon is a fantastic example of really diving into the complexity of history. I mean, we've talked about already several times about the paradoxes within Napoleon. He's neither fully good nor fully bad. And so I think for students, Napoleon is a wonderful exercise in thinking critically about the past. For example, in class, we did a debate. And so the question was, is Napoleon a friend or an enemy of the French Revolution?
Wow.
In other words, does Napoleon embody what the revolution was originally trying to capture, or is he someone who's squashing the gains made by the previous revolutionaries? And what I hope to see, and what I did see as we had these discussions, is that students slowly began to see that in a way both were true at the same time. So I think that just shows the fantastic complexity that we get to see when we study history and exercising those modes of thinking in the classroom.
Sure. And I'm sure one question people have out there, I certainly do, the recent movie.
Yes.
How good? How good is it? How accurate? Or
So
what do you think?
I'll personally have to confess that I'm waiting for the costs to go down on Amazon to rent the movie.
There you go. That's
So
all right.
I don't want to make any major judgments not having seen the movie myself.
Okay. Well, that's all right. Yeah. We all want to know. We'll have to share with you out there when we get his expert opinion on the movie. We'll let you know. I enjoyed it.
Oh, that's good.
Very much because I find him a fascinating historical figure, and I thought they they did a good job of showing the complexity of the man, but my naivete and a lack of full education on him, I don't know. I mean, you may watch it and say, why have they done this to this historical figure? So I just don't know. So if I'm a parent at home, I have a student who's studying Napoleon with you, what's a good question I could ask them?
Well, I think maybe one of the questions we've already talked about, to what extent does Napoleon embody the French Revolution? And this was a question that was really relevant to his day. For example, Napoleon himself marketed himself as this embodiment, this physical embodiment of the French Revolution. When he comes to power, he says, the revolution's over. I am the revolution. And so to Napoleon, his victory, if he comes out on top, then at the end of the day, the French Revolution has won and everything that it stood for. But on the other hand, are there these contradictions that he's doing? And so I think it's also, just as it was relevant for his day and how he marketed himself, it's relevant to us as well as we think about what these principles of government really were, what the objective should be for some of these modes of thinking about government.
Right.
And so I think that would be a fantastic question.
That's a great question. And do you get a diversity of opinions and views from the students?
Oh, absolutely.
I'll bet you have some great discussions. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, because it's very interesting. Oftentimes when they're coming out of the classes, I can hear them carrying on discussions, and I love that. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure they walk into your class talking about chemistry and the mitochondrial cell respiration, but maybe they do. You can pretend they do anyway. Anything else? Overall, big picture. What do you want parents to know out there who may be considering classical education? I think we really want to encourage people to understand the importance of classical education and approaching the study of a very interesting historical figure like Napoleon. What would you say to them about why this should be approached from a classical perspective?
Well, I think with classical education, one of the most amazing things about it is the emphasis on critical thinking and thinking about history as a skill set, studying history critically as opposed to just memorizing facts. And with Napoleon and Napoleonic France, there's so many opportunities for historical analysis, asking really good questions. We've already talked in depth about the complexity of Napoleon. I think another just anecdotal example about ways I've seen this in the classroom is students will often come into the classroom with preconceived notions about Napoleon. I think, either he's this just greatest mastermind of military political history, this hero that we should all aspire to be, or he's this villain. I had one student oh yeah, he's just he was like the precursor to Hitler, right? And so I think with Napoleon, just with any other good really exploration of history in classical education, it allows students to maybe push back in a way against some of these preconceived notions, to dive deeper and to really explore their own questions and curiosities and understand that, as we've said so many times, that history isn't just a story about good guys versus bad guys.
Sure, absolutely. I think that's fantastic. And I know everybody out there is listening saying, boy, I wish I could come there and sit in on these discussions about this very intriguing character, Napoleon Bonaparte. Thank you so much, Monsieur Geiser.
You're welcome.
For being with us this evening. And thank all of you for coming and joining us. I hope this inspires you to talk to your students about their studies and their discussions about Napoleon. Maybe do a little research on your own. He's a fascinating character, and I'm sure there's no end to those studies. I know I am at this point very intrigued to know more, but first I want to find out about that movie. Did they do a good job? Let me know first thing. And to all of you out there, thank you so much for joining us on the Classical Academy podcast, presented by Trinity U, a service of Trinity Classical Academy right here in Santa Clarita, California. Our producer is Shay Ramquist. Stephen Petrie is our audio engineer and provides our original music that you hear right now. Until next time, let's all continue to grow in virtue, in wisdom, and in the love of God. Till next time, thanks.